Hello, welcome. Today I have a very awesome opportunity. I'm going to be talking about Vastarian magazine or literary journal, and I'm going to be talking with the editor-in-chief, Jon Padgett, and also a couple of writers recently who have contributed to this, what you see right here. Some of the contributors for that very episode, Daniel Braum and Gwendolyn Kiste. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Thank you so much for having
Thanks for
us.
having us, Jason.
All right, so Jon, we're going to start with you. Do you mind giving yourself a short introduction?
Yeah, so I started out as I'm sure all of us did as an avid reader of dark material and horror. I worked my way up and found my favorite author with Thomas Ligotti in the early 90s. Befriended him in the late 90s, created Thomas Ligotti online. All this time I was trying to write a good story, and I kept rewriting this one story over and over and over again for almost 20 years. And that became 20 Simple Steps of Ventriloquism. I wrote some other stories, published The Secret of Ventriloquism in 2016. And in 2018, along with some pivotal people who were interested in seeing kind of Ligottian themed journal, we created Vastarien, a literary journal, in 2018. And that was also the inaugural Grimscribe Press publication. Since then, we have published 10 issues of Vastarien, initially 3 times a year. A couple of years ago, that changed to 2 times a year. And also started putting out very few books through Grimscribe Press, including the recently Braum Stoker Award-winning Gemma Files collection, In That Endlessness Our End, and this by Kurt Fauber, We Are Happy We Are Doomed, who I was delighted to find out has been nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award. And in the meantime, Vastarien has had award-winning nonfiction and fiction pieces as well. Gwendolyn Kiste, who is here with us, the recipient of one of those, among her many at this point, Stoker Awards. And we are just delighted to have her in the most recent edition of Vastarien as well, with another extraordinary nonfiction piece. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm a writer, but mostly these days an editor and a publisher of other work that I admire. The last thing that I want to show all of you is that a lot of people have commented on how much they like the cover of the most recent Vastarien issue.
It's awesome.
And the artist, Jason Barnett, actually sent me the original artwork, which is really, really cool. If you can see, it's actually three-dimensional with the text on the on the piece itself. So that was a very generous gift.
So you started. I know that you're. It would be a small thing to say. Words, they're not coming. It would be a small thing to say that you love Thomas Ligotti's work. What is it about his work that really pulls at you?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, it's kind of it's it's the only way that I can describe it is when he was the first writer that I read that almost felt um, like he was writing from inside my own head. Um, you know what I mean? I mean, I always felt like, oh, well, this is brilliant. There's no way that I could create these stories and these poems and these pieces, but I felt like I had a deep understanding of them. Like they so in such a personal and paradoxically emotional way. Like I I really got it, and that was the first author that I really felt like uh, um, felt like cured me of almost a sense of loneliness that I always had. Yeah.
I love that. That's so great because I feel like Ligotti is so often considered just so nihilistic, but I love the fact that you're like, I feel less lonely reading Ligotti. That's such a wonderful like perspective on it. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think that quite a number of his avid readers feel similarly. You know, it's um, I remember back in the mid '90s, I was in grad school in English literature, and I was working in the literature section of the university library, and I read The Bungalow House for the first time, which, if you've read it, is from the perspective of a librarian working in the language and literature section of a library, and coming across the work of this audio artist who makes what he calls these dream monologues that he finds in a rundown art studio nearby. And so I'm reading this on my lunch breaks while I'm reading about him on his lunch breaks, listening to this artist whose work seems like it could have come directly out of his mind. So I've had certain like weird metafictional coincidences when it comes to his work, and it's a very intimate kind of thing to me. And I was lucky enough to uh, I've been friends with him now for 25 years, and uh, and I've been lucky enough to get to know the man, and he is one of the most funny and generous uh, um, people I've ever known. He's truly one of my closest friends, and I, I I just feel, you know, I always growing up when I started reading Lovecraft for the first time, I always thought, oh, you know, wow, what would that be like to uh, uh, befriend you know, the author that you felt uh, some kind of kinship with, and I lived the dream, I guess. It's been a really special thing, and I'm glad that one of the goals of my adult life has been to promote Tom's work from the it started with just friends in college saying, "Hey, let me read you this story," or here, borrow this book. I gave out so many copies of the book, and then that morphed into Usenet, talking about him in the 90s online, creating the website, and ultimately getting in touch with him, publishing some of his work for the first time on the website, like My Work Is Not Yet Done, for instance, or the Crampton X-Files script. And then eventually, all of this culminated in Grimscribe Press and Vastarian as well. Vastarian, it's interesting because the work that we get from Vastarian is so high quality. I mean, I know that may sound false, but it's really true. I always thought that if I edited a magazine, it would be really easy to go through the submissions and select which ones to accept and which ones to reject. But I've had just the opposite problem. A lot of times I'm ending up rejecting work that I really, really like, and it's really hard to decide between pieces because there's just something there's something about this mode of writing that it really brings out the best and creativity and as far as content and style. I just feel very fortunate to be in this role, and to be able to promote the work of writers that are well known and writers that are not well known at all, but that are marvelous.
One thing I love about the stories is a lot of them are character driven, which is that's sort of what I enjoy reading about. And also, they also pull on a lot of philosophical things that, philosophy. How is that, like, from my understanding, it started off being sort of like a Ligotti tribute, but how has that evolved over the years?
Well, it's funny because when the small group of us, including Matt Carden, were initially coming up with the concept, we all decided, we don't want this to just be, okay, send us your Ligotti pastiche. We wanted work that either intentionally or unintentionally kind of intersected in some way with some of the themes and imagery that Ligotti often uses, and not only Ligotti, but the authors that Ligotti has been influenced by or has influenced. We published work that is in conversation with Ligotti's work in even in negative senses that push against his philosophical viewpoint, and that's ultimately what we want. It's odd because, as I said, we'll get kind of conventional stories every now and then that are just, flat out, this is, your basic werewolf story, or this is your basic zombie story, dystopia, whatever. But usually that's not the case. Usually it's the case that the submissions we get are just very unusual. They see things from they are presented from a not only an unusual angle, but are often what you might call literary in nature. And, I pushed against that subtitle when we were first creating uh, the journal, but I was outvoted, and now I'm glad. I was afraid that calling it a literary journal would seem off-putting or pretentious, um, uh, but it really I think it's really true. It's there is a high quality to the work that we publish, and we're just inundated with high quality work.
Do you find, because being a writer myself, reading guidelines, sometimes you come across some guidelines where the editors are frustrated, and you can tell because they'll be like, "Please read an issue before submitting." And do you find that people actually read your magazine before submitting?
I think so. And that's one of the things I think that has been good that has come out of the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, I decided to make all of the work that Grimscribe Press publishes uh, pay what you can uh, electronic editions. So literally, people can buy books or issues for a penny if they want to, and that really increased sales a lot, electronic sales as well as physical sales. And what I found is that most people um, really do pay what they can. So for every person that buys an issue for a penny, another person is buying a book for, $15, $20, an electronic edition, just to be supportive. So we've been very fortunate in that way, and so yes, I think a lot of the authors now have read at least some of the work that is fairly readily available at this point, and that's been one of the things that I've really wanted to do with this journal is make it affordable to consume, because so much weird fiction is high priced and can be limited, and especially with Ligotti's past work before the Penguin editions, and after the Carol and Graff books went away, it became very difficult, and it's still very difficult.
It still is, yeah.
And I wanted to avoid that. And I don't know. I think it's been cool because I think that the authors and artists have enriched Vastarian, but they've also helped to diversify Ligotti's audience in a way. I mean, when it started, we caught some flack in that first issue, and rightfully so, because it appeared from the table of contents there actually were some non-males that were published in it, but they all of them were using not pseudonyms but initials. So it wasn't readily clear looking at the table of contents that there was anything except male writers. And Ligotti for very many years has had a big reader base that is very male and probably pretty damn white. And we've gone out of our way to try to change that. That's why every February we open up to non-males only for that month. And I think that's been one of the best decisions that we've made, because we get tons and tons of work from all uh, uh, people when we open in June, and in this case June and July. Um, but that influx is just amazing, and I think. Um, um, One of the cool things to see too, I was just looking back at our past table of contents, and the number of non-binary um, writers and artists that we have is, the percentage is high. And it's really cool that this kind of material really reaches beyond that you know very typical traditional cisgender white male demographic.
I
You did
remember
an amazing
actually.
job with that, John. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
I remember.
I've gifted. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead, Dan.
I just want to echo that and say that John, you and your team have done an amazing job in presenting diverse voices consistently, and the readership knows it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I remember when that was going down on Facebook, and it was a bit of a controversy at the time. And I remember some people saying, it's what you just said. Uh, it's not easy finding people, but with the things that you implemented, is it easier finding writers now who are cis or
It
POCs?
is. It absolutely is. I mean, even during our general submissions, we get a lot of non-white cisgender work, and it's the word has spread over the course of years, as I hoped it would, and more. And what I hope is occurring too is more and more of these authors and the readership being more diverse is going to get interested in Ligotti's work and say, I want to check this out, because Ligotti's work is nothing if not transgressive and strange, and not of the norm. I think one of the things that when I was at the Necronomicon recently, in a panel, it was a panel about weird fiction, and we were talking about the absurd and absurdism, and it just occurred to me to ask the audience. My wife didn't think that this was appropriate for me to do, but I asked the audience, how many of you have struggled with mental illness, or have somebody that you love in your life who has struggled or is struggling with mental illness? And just about everybody raised their hand, including me. And so there are things that absolutely, I think, in the weird fiction community, absolutely unite us, and I believe that's one of them. I mean, a lot of us have felt like outsiders, or have struggled with mental issues, and it's something that I don't think is talked about as much, because there is such a stigma when it comes to mental illness.
There is
still in this country and around the world, and I think that it's I one of the things that reading Ligotti did for me is made me realize that it helped make me not feel ashamed anymore, and to be able to write about painful things that I wouldn't have been able to write about 20 years ago, let alone 30 years ago.
Awesome. I was wondering, do you have any standout issues that are your favorite?
Oh, you know, it seems like every issue that comes out is my favorite issue.
Yeah.
You know, I would really have to look back. I'm really, yeah, I'm really still just very much in love with this issue. Um, I, I, I feel like from an editorial and typographical standpoint, I feel like the issues are getting cleaner on the page and better. But I mean, there's so much incredible work in each and every one of these issues, and it's amazing because as they're being put together, it feels every time I think, oh, this is not going to. This time it's not going to come together. It's going to be disjointed, or you know, there won't be any theme or through line. And every time the work that gets chosen just coalesces. It's almost like it puts itself together. It's and I'm always once it's all done, I'm always astonished by the end product. You know, and it's a marvelous feeling. It really is.
What is it like putting an issue together? Like, where does it start and how does it end?
Yeah, so it starts with well, it's been different at different times, but you know, for the past couple of years, it's mostly been me doing this on my own, and just because my fellow co-editors, you know, they've had their own things going on in their lives and their own projects, and this Vastarian is just a really big priority for me. So I start out with the work that we've accepted. You know, I lay it out. I look at it. I reread the works, and then the selection process kind of, like I said, you know, these pieces kind of. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. They fit together, and in just the right way usually. Even the order very quickly becomes apparent. I put together, you know, that, and then the art starts coming in certain areas. And then I start creating drafts, and I'll read through the draft and see if everything makes sense. Every now and then I'll reorder a little, but usually the initial order tends to be the one that wants to be there, and then it's just a matter of cleaning things up, and finding errors. Making editorial suggestions, sending out galleys to the authors and artists, and then it's the content is done. And of course, it's completely different with the cover and cover art and layout and all of that. But very fortunately, one of my colleagues and friends, Anna Truman, she does a fantastic job with all of that. So usually all I have to do is give her the cover art, and the list of contributors, and that's it.
Awesome. So Vastarian has been out since about 2018, correct?
Yeah,
And still going. You seem to really love doing it still, just by the way you're talking.
I do.
Do you have a vision for where you want it to go in the future?
I just want to keep on putting it out. You know, I scaled. You know, at one point, early on in the pandemic, I realized, okay, I've bitten off a little more than I can chew with some of the other books that Grim Scrub was publishing. I dearly love everything that we've published, but just having to juggle that with my day job became too hard, and so that has been scaled back. But Vastarian, twice a year, that's here to stay, no matter what happens. I don't see us. You know, it's self-sustaining. It's not. It's certainly not making money, but it's paying for itself. And as long as it keeps on paying for itself, I'm going to keep doing it.
Awesome. One last question from me. What advice would you have for any newer writers who are thinking about submitting work to Vastarian?
Yeah, I hate to do the old cliche of like read our journal, but really, I mean, it's in this case it's easy to do, as long as you don't despise reading books or journals electronically. Then buy a Kindle or an EPUB edition, for 25 cents or whatever you can afford, and see if you have any work that would kind of fit in with and it's funny because it seems, and even I thought at first that like this is going to be really niche. I mean, there's not going to be a whole lot of writers that are going to submit the kind of work that we would be interested in. And I've just been completely surprised by how creative and unexpected the work that we receive is. So I pretty much trust the authors on this. They've been fantastic and very patient as well. My submission process has slowed down quite a bit, unfortunately. So for those of you that are out there that are still waiting for acceptances or rejections, then just hang on with me, because we look very closely at the work that we receive, and as I said before, it's very difficult sometimes to make the final decision on the work that we receive, and keep at it. There are other cliches that come to mind as well. For young writers, reading. I mean, obviously, if you're a writer, you're probably a reader, and I would strongly recommend getting a small group of people to read your work and to give you feedback on it. Don't write in isolation if you can help it. I know for a long time that's exactly what I did. And it really, really helped me when I started sharing my work with some people whose opinion I trust, including Ligotti, which I was lucky enough to have as a mentor.
That must have been intimidating.
It was, and ego destroying over the course of many years. I mean, there were probably the first 10 years of getting, his feedback was just him saying, you don't know how to write. That's the basic problem. This is interesting. This is interesting, but the rest of it's, you need to go back to the drawing board. Yeah. So I mean, there were many times that I was thinking, well, that's it. I'm not gonna try doing this anymore. I'm just not a writer. But something in me just wouldn't give up. And for young writers, I would say too, as much as you can, try to check your ego at the door. It's very hard to do when you first start out, because you write something that you think like, oh, this is amazing. I mean, your own ideas about your work can, especially at first, be very distorted. It's sometimes distorted in a negative way, sometimes distorted in a positive way. For me, it was very much distorted in a positive way. I thought that my first draft of this story back in the mid 90s was brilliant, and it was definitely not. And it took somebody that I really respected telling me that to get me on the road to, this is bad, but why is it bad? Why is it not working? Just be patient with yourself. Keep trying.
All right. Dan, Gwendolyn, do you guys have any questions for Jon before we move on to Gwendolyn?
No, one thing I do want to say, though, that I think is interesting, and you kind of brought up some of this, is that there is this great mix of recognizable names in every issue, and then people I haven't maybe heard of or only kind of briefly seen on social media. And what's been so much fun over the course of the last 4 years of reading Vastarian is how much like a lot of those names that I didn't know are now names that are popping up everywhere. And it's really exciting. So it's at the point now that if I see somebody in Vastarian that I don't recognize, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be seeing them everywhere now. So it's like this really nice thing of like you said, the combination of people that we do recognize and then newer writers, and it's always exciting. Or I'll know of a writer that I'm like, I love their work and I would love to see them do more. Then they're in Vastarian. I'm like, okay, they've arrived. Like that's totally like the bellwether. Like, yay! Like they're gonna get their work out there to so many more people. Like once it's in Vastarian, so it's like not only a great place for people who have been, published and recognizable, but it's such a great launching pad for newer voices, and that's such a wonderful thing to see. So
yeah, it's very gratifying. That's the thing I love about this job most of all, is getting great work out there, from a lot of people who are not well known. It's really cool, like you said.
Jon, you just did you're so well spoken, and I've just been transfixed listening to you and Jason talk about your story and the story of Vastarian. I just want to echo the great job that you're doing. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to a lot of people to have newer writers and diverse writers. I recently gifted some of the copies of Vastarian I had to people, people who might ordinarily be like, okay, yeah, it's the same old. And yeah, they recognize themselves, and they recognize some of these voices, and it just was great. It was great to see that. And your mission with the work of Ligotti, I'm one of your mission accomplished people in that I had not read Ligotti before reading your work and reading Vastarian. So, I'm a newcomer and a student of learning about him. And it's fascinating to hear you say about how how the journal is, more than a tribute, more than prestige. It's about even pushing back, or the intersections of it, the intersections with his work. And that's just something, as a writer and as a reader, that I find really exciting, and just want to give a big hats off to that, and to your entire team, and the authors and artists in here. So
Yeah.
cheers.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that this was my first Ligotti, Teatro Grottesco, and oh my God, man, I read it in like 2010, I think, and it was like unlike anything I'd ever read before.
Maybe his overall best.
Yeah, it blew my mind.
It's hard to beat. It's wonderful, and all I could say is without people like you, Dan, and Gwendolyn, Vastarian wouldn't work. I mean, it's the thing that has been so eye-opening to me, and again gratifying, is how humane these issues end up being to me. I mean, it's like this. So often, the work in Vastarian, you would think, because it's Ligotti influenced or what have you, that it might be kind of cold, experimental, again, like Gwendolyn's like nihilistic, but it really, the thing that it captures, that I've always felt with Ligotti's work is a deep sense of humanity, and connection. I mean, paradoxically, because his work and a lot of the work in Vastarian as well is very bleak, but again, as Jason said, so much of this work is character driven, and very much voiced. And I mean, I've been emotionally moved by so much of the work that we've published, and have felt that deep sense of connection. And I feel like it's a real interrelated web of relationships and common bonds.
If I don't get a chance to do this as the show moves on, look, this entire issue is full of top-notch, fantastic stories. I just want to give a shout out to a story or two that are just my favorites so far.
Sure.
For The Night Is Long and I Am Lost Without You by Erica Rufford.
Yeah.
And Deep Sea Creature by Vivian Casley. Like, look, they really embody what you've been saying about the project, and they're just eye-opening, really standout stories. In a volume of standout stories.
Yeah, I agree. So much of the work, the fiction and poetry, is like, Poe's heart laid bare quote. It's just it's very personal, and difficult emotionally, but it's so I mean, I find a lot of it to be very brave, as a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you, Jon. If you don't mind, we're going to move on to Gwendolyn now. She wrote, I've read it twice now. She wrote a pretty awesome piece. It's it's an essay. I'm just getting over being sick, so please don't mind me if I, blunder with my words. But before we get into your essay, I just wanted to say that you just have a new book that just came out.
I do.
Reluctant Immortals. I haven't read it yet, but I do have it, and I'm looking forward to digging in. So can you tell us a little bit about it before?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it just came out like a little over a month ago from Saga Press, and it is the story of two forgotten Gothic heroines, Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha Antoinetta Mason from Jane Eyre. And they are the reluctant immortals of the title, living in 1967 California when Dracula and Edward Rochester make a very sudden return to their lives. So I keep describing it as like a feminist Hammer film. Like it's just like it's kind of like a buddy adventure. It's very gothic. It's got a lot of dark humor, you know, and it's definitely got like dark fantasy horror elements. So it's really like if you like those kind of classic Hammer movies, that's very much the kind of vein that I wrote it in. So, oh, thanks, Suze. Thanks.
Yeah,
Jason, you're gonna love it. It's like the book is so good, you can't believe it. It's just you're gonna love it.
well, you sold me with the feminine version of a Hammer film. I absolutely love Hammer films, and
Yes, so do I. I grew up with them. I grew up watching them with
me
my
too.
dad, and so I just love them so much. Oh, thanks, Christy. Yeah, so I just, you know, I've always I can't read that whole comment. Like there's a question.
The
like,
Rust Maiden Shirley Jackson reference.
Jackson references
Easter egg and
probably. If you're going to ask me about the Rust Maidens, I always feel so bad saying this. That was like 4 years ago I wrote it, and I always feel bad that after so many years, like somebody could ask me, probably. I feel like there was probably like some intentional like homage to Shirley Jackson in there. But it was so long ago. Like I always feel bad even when a book's come out and I wrote it a year before, and people ask me questions and I'm like, I should know the answer to this, but that was a year ago, and it's been a long few years for all of us. So
Yeah,
So you
felt
say
like
yes
a
to the
country.
flattering stuff, and I don't know to the questionable stuff, right?
Yeah, I can't wait to read it.
Right, your essay is The Devil's Just Sitting There Laughing.
yes.
It's the uncanny landscapes of Terrence Malick's Badlands and Days of Heaven.
Yes.
So, when were you first introduced to this filmmaker?
You know, not really that long ago. Like, I mean, in terms of really getting into his work, I knew of Terrence Malick. I remember, like, I was an avid Entertainment Weekly reader when I was growing up because I lived in a small town and we didn't have a lot of access to movies. And so Entertainment Weekly was like this way of being able to access things, you know, that maybe would never come to our theater or even our video store, but I could at least know about them. And so I remember when The Thin Red Line came out in like 97, I think it was, in the late 90s. And it was this big deal that this filmmaker hadn't made a movie in like 20 years. And so I very much remember that. Now, I think I only ever saw part of that when I was young. And I'll be honest, I've never really like war movies. You know, I always connect more with things with a lot of female characters, not a lot of female characters in The Thin Red Line. So, you know, I don't think I kind of got it when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, as the years went on, I heard about Badlands and I heard of Days of Heaven. And with Badlands, I think I talk about this in the essay, one of the things I was worried about is I knew it was based on the Starkweather homicides. And I was like, oh, you know, a lot of times that's done in a way that I feel like really glorifies or glamorizes the killers. And so that was I'd actually avoided Badlands for years specifically because I was like, it's probably just going to be like a Helter Skelter thing where you're going to come out the other side and you're going to feel like it's very, you know, almost like this kind of isn't it great and glamorized. And then I watched it and was just shocked at how I've never seen less glamorized, you know, killing spree in a movie. This is not Natural Born Killers. There's nothing about it that's glamorized. It's like the opposite of that. And so I was very surprised because that's not what I was thinking going into it. And it was a nice surprise because I think I say this in the essay. It's like almost like an anti-crime movie about crime because it's like, hey, look, crime not only doesn't pay, it's not even fun. You're not even going to have fun doing crime. And that was really like so different than a lot of, like, I even grew up watching noir and I love noir, but a lot of times, even if something bad happens, they might have fun along the way getting there and being bad. But in Badlands, it's nothing like that. And that just really was so interesting to me and such a different take on that kind of crime spree film that I think we all know of a lot of those types of movies. And it was just such a different approach. Yeah. And then I just love Days of Heaven. I think it's beautiful. I love all of the major actors in it. You know, feel like I knew Richard Gere from the time I was very young, but then I love Sam Shepard and I love Brooke Adams. And so it was just like each one of them had been in other movies or, you know, written things that I've liked. And so to have them all come together, and they're all so young in it. They're all so young. It's like so early in all their careers. And it's just like this really like sweet moment in like this kind of more auteur driven cinema of the 70s, where it really was this moment when it really was about the directors and about these kind of unusual visions, you know, that people were getting made at the time. And so it's just such an interesting film. And we were talking about this before this started. It's such a slow moving film. Mm-hmm. It is not a fast moving film. I can't imagine Days of Heaven getting made now because it is slow. You got to take your time. You know, it's like watching a painting that just moves sometimes. Because sometimes it's just like, we're going to look at this sunset. We're just going to stare at it for a while. We're just going to watch the sunset like we're sitting on a porch watching it. And I love that because it does take its time and it does enjoy those landscapes. And sometimes they're very scary. Sometimes they're very beautiful. Sometimes they're very frightening. Sometimes they're both. You know, it filmed, there's a fire in the film, and it's shot in a way that's both terrifying, but at times very beautiful. And so it's this interesting juxtaposition of the terrifying and the sublime. And you know, as a horror writer and as you know, a weird fiction writer, that's just the best to me, where you have these moments that are so unsettling but very beautiful at the same time, and you almost don't know how to feel about it. It's very like there's a lot of like cognitive dissonance, and so I was just very in awe of those two movies in particular.
Yeah, I like what we were talking about before going live here is that especially with like Days of Heaven, there's like a good half hour or more where you're just watching them work in the fields. Mm-hmm. And it's not boring. Like I think my son would probably find it terribly boring, but I found myself captivated. I was like, you know, I thought my job was horrible, but these guys, my God, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's intense in both movies, both Badlands and Days of Heaven. Days of Heaven more so, but even in Badlands, there's scenes of just people working. That's just a big part of especially those two films. And it's just so interesting because we don't spend a lot of time really looking at how hard blue collar labor is. And it's hard. It's hard work. And it's like most movies, even if you have people who maybe work in a factory or something, it's kind of like a montage, or you'll just see them when they're getting off at the end of the day. Like, oh, everybody's leaving from the factory. And that's where you come in most movies. But with Malik's work and these two films in particular, you really spend time. And Days of Heaven, you really get to see the thresher. There was a lot of things that like I'm looking at the first time I'm watching this. I'm like, I don't know a lot about farm equipment. I live on an abandoned horse farm. Like this used to be a horse farm, but I'm not originally from the country. So I'm like looking at this and I'd ask my husband, like, is that a thresher? What are we looking at exactly? And like, you know, and it's very scary because you also see all the poor little animals and things. It's like, get out of the way, little animals. You might not make it if you don't. It's like animals are running. And it's like, I'm not sure they all made it, but yeah. But I mean, honestly, that is how it would be, you know, with the actual, some of the animals don't make it, which is like sad and scary, but also real as to how farm life is, you know, so it's a cool world.
One thing I really like of what you said earlier was that Badlands being an anti-crime film, because Thin Red Line was an anti-war film. Mm-hmm. And with most movies that call them like war movies that call themselves anti-war, like I'm going to use Saving Private Ryan. It's a very good movie, but you look at those battle scenes and they're so terrifying, but at the same time there's some kind of love going into it as well. You know what I mean? Mm. But you don't get that with Thin Red Line.
Mm. No. There is an interesting like kind of cynicism in a lot of Terrence Malick's work of you know, again, like seeing something, but also being like, this isn't a great way for the world to be. It's not really like you said, a lot of war movies, it does glorify it. Like, oh, isn't it great? We all go to war. And especially older movies that are war movies. And that's why a lot of times I haven't been able to get into war movies a lot because I feel so often like there can be a real glamorization of war.
For sure. And then they say that they're anti-war. But you see all the people who are in the military who want to go to war watching these movies and getting off on it.
Yeah, and you're right. Like the Thin Red Line does not have that feel. It's a very, very somber film. It's a very sad film, and it isn't about like, oh, isn't it great we're at war? It's like, oh, this is terrible. This is really awful. And there's not like, and like you said, even some movies that call themselves anti-war, there's still this kind of like aren't we so tough? Look at us, we're still surviving. And with Thin Red Line, it's just emotionally, these people are battered. They're very battered, as people really are when they come back from war or when they're in war. And we don't talk about that a lot. It's supposed to be something that's like, oh, it's just good. Look how wonderful this is. And it's like, this hurts people. This is something that's very harmful to people's mental health, sometimes for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely.
It fits in the Ligotti tradition, just thinking about what all three of you have been saying, in that while Malik's, like Badlands and Days of Heaven, they show like a half hour of people working. Even the Thin Red Line, the first half hour of that movie is soldiers getting ready and talking about how goddamn scared they are. And it just fits in what you're saying in that. And the other point that I love that you made in your essay, Gwendolyn, and it fits in with what you're saying here on, it's just brilliant that you categorize these three films as a cosmic horror. And just how you're saying, and first it's like, wow, that's a wild thing. These are completely earthbound films, although Malik does eventually take off beyond Earth. But just by the the sheer weight of like the indifference and the non-glamorization and the human experience, and side by side by overwhelming aspects of nature and life, I'm like, like it might not be outer space, but that same Ligotti nature, that same cosmic horror notions is really coming through loud and clear once I unlocked it by seeing the movies through your lens. And I'm just still like really excited about watching the movies, thinking about your essay.
Thank you. That makes me so happy.
I actually rewatched them over the past couple of days, and I was so taken by Days of Heaven. I kept on thinking about that famous Emily Dickinson quote, "Nature is a haunted house," and it's I mean the landscape is so haunted in that film. I mean, he captures Malik he captures that sense of it's weird because it is the natural world, it is nature, and yet it can be so alienating in those huge wheat fields, and ultimately, when there's the grand infestation near the end of the movie of the farmland with the fire and the swarms coming down in the fire, it's very much cosmic horror, very much just out of anybody's control.
Yeah, and like that was something that the first time I watched Days of Heaven, I'm like, this landscape, you're right, it feels so haunted, and it feels like even though it's wide open and it feels like, oh, you could escape in any direction, there's nowhere to hide. Like you could run in any direction, but you can't hide from anyone because it's so flat. But also it just was so interesting to me how oppressive it was, even being so wide open. It was like you said, nature is the haunted house. Like, and at that point, there's nowhere to escape. Like you think of like a haunted house, you think, oh, well, I can just get to the front door, or the back door, or through a window, or anywhere, and I can get out. But it's like when it's all of nature, it's so much more sinister and it's so much scarier. Because how do you escape that?
Yeah, and it's so exposed. Like when the farmer finally sees the brother and sister together definitively in this private, personal, intimate moment. I mean, there's nothing to hide it.
Yeah,
it's just all wide open.
And I don't think I got into this in the essay, but every time I watch the movie, I'm always like, you guys couldn't just like stay away from each other for what? Like the farmers, not that I want them to get away with it because they're not doing something nice, but I'm like, this was a ruse you guys could have gotten away with. It was a workable ruse. It was not kind. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm like, just like, keep your distance for like a year or two, and like you guys would have been set. But I know that's the whole point of it. That's part of the horror of it. That's part of the tragedy. But every time I'm like, you two, like,
behave yourselves.
The there's also present in all the movies is that cosmic horror notion that there are forces out there that are so big and nothing that we do is going to matter in organic to all of the points of the films. Like I love at the end of Badlands when Kit, who's the mass murderer, and he thinks he's so charming and he thinks he has his Han Solo moral code, and he's even to the end when he's about to, he's being sentenced or he's being driven away, and he's trying to be so charming to the officer and like complimenting his hat, and he tells the officer, he's like, do you think that's going to matter? He's like, Kit, you're something else. You're quite a piece of work, Kit. And he's like, thank you. Do you think that's going to matter? And they're like, nope. It's like the ultimate in crime doesn't pay, the ultimate in not glorifying it, but it lines up with the points of at least the other two films we're discussing. Days of Heaven and Thin Red Line. Like there's a moment that lines perfectly to me in Thin Red Line when the soldiers they're expecting to be mowed down on the beach, and they land on the beach and they don't get mowed down, and they're just in this state of shock. And instead of like being celebratory, it's this immense sense of horror where one of them, think like Adrian Brody or whoever, turns to the other guy and goes, wait a minute, if the brass think they're so smart and they thought this was going to be a killing field, what else don't they know? Like they were just so afraid that like the world that they thought they knew was not, that they were just like, even though they had been spared at the moment, they were like, we're living a horror, and that's something that's both horrifying and sublime at the same time. And I think there are moments in Malik movies that capture and just line up as what I think of as cosmic horror.
Yeah, it wasn't just the soldiers who thought that they were going to be mowed down on the beach. The audience thought so too. So I went to the theater to see that, and we all saw Saving Private Ryan beforehand, right? And when they pull up on the beach, we're like, here it is. But then they all storm out and they run and they keep running and they keep running. And you're like, where's the bombs? Where's the guns?
Yeah, just the chaos and randomness of life. I feel like Malik really like underscores that a lot in his work. And there is such a randomness of life. Like, I know I always fall into this idea of like, oh, if I work hard enough, I'll be able to like figure out how to predict what's going to happen next. And then so often it's like, no, you're not going to be able to, because so much of life is chaos. There's a certain things that you can maybe predict, but like most of the time it is just random. And I think a lot of us want to believe there is some semblance of logic in the chaos, but sometimes there's just not. And yeah, that scene with this like idea of like, oh well, they don't really know what they're doing, and it's like, yeah, that's one of the things I feel I've learned most in adulthood is that nobody's ever really known what they're doing. When you're a little kid, you're like, people know what they're doing. Somebody somewhere knows what they're doing. The longer I'm like alive, I'm like, oh, nobody knows what they're doing. Everything is kind of like elaborate guesswork. We do our best, hopefully, but that's it. Like there's not. A lot of things are guessing and doing your best, but like understanding that a lot of things are just chaos and it's random and there's no, and again, that's like a kind of cosmic horror, this idea of just like the unfeeling nature of the universe. It's not out to get us necessarily, but it's not out to help us. And so that kind of idea
accidentally crush us all the same.
Mm-hmm.
The uncertainty. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that at certain times in Badlands, I sort of had the idea that Malik was almost a proto David Lynch in some of the scenes, like when Kit and Holly are dancing in the headlights to Nat King Cole, and it's this absurd moment, but very very haunting, and especially with Holly becoming more and more aware that Kit's trajectory is not a place that she wants to go.
Yeah, I like that. I like that comparison to David Lynch, because like right around the time that I was rewatching to write this, I was watching some David Lynch, and I think I even said to my husband, there's like a lot of crossover, and you don't necessarily think it when you just kind of look even at stills of the films, because they look very different stylistically. But a lot of this kind of juxtaposition of the ordinary and the absurd really does pervade both of their work. And I think there's a couple dance scenes in Badlands, and the earlier one is just as weird, like when they dance, like when they got that little like tree fort, and it's so weird and awkward, and they're so awkward together. And that does have a feel of like David Lynch's work, because a lot of times there'll be these things and it's just very awkward to even watch, and you're like, I don't think I should be watching this. This seems like something that's happening, and I'm like maybe across the room from somebody, and I'm like, I shouldn't even be watching this. This isn't appropriate. They're just being weird.
Yeah. And it's specifically Americana horror, like both of those directors are very, very much they've got a bead on it in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that really appeals to me with both their work, is I always say I'm a very American writer in a lot of ways, because not only have I grown up in America, but like America is weird. It's a weird place. We don't talk about how weird America is, and it is. And it's like, I feel like Malik and Lynch really understand that. They have that kind of like, they see into that, and how strange it really is to live in this country sometimes, and how absurd aspects of just the way we live really are. And so that I do think really appeals to me about both of them.
Absolutely. That's what I love about their work, is just exactly what you were saying, how they pull from reality and they turn it kind of upside down to show us exactly who and what we are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. So moving on, Gwendolyn is going to read us a piece from her essay. So I'm gonna put you on full screen here.
All right.
And you can go right ahead.
All right. Sounds good.
There we go.
All right. So again, the title of the essay is "The Devil's Just Sitting There Laughing: The Uncanny American Landscapes of Terrence Malick's Badlands and Days of Heaven." A plague of locusts, a legendary murder spree, fires that obliterate homes, and all the hopes that go with them. While often lauded among cinema fans, Terrence Malick's work is rarely given its due through the lens of horror and the weird, despite having clear elements of both. In particular, his first two feature films, 1973's Badlands and 1978's Days of Heaven, are rife with unsettling and haunting images that evoke classic ghost stories, a decidedly gothic aesthetic, tales of true crime, and even occasionally cosmic horror. The American Dream Dissected. In his highly lauded debut, Badlands, Terrence Malick introduces us to Kit and Holly, played with disarming coolness by young Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek, a pair of small-town kids from South Dakota. Loosely based on the Starkweather homicides, the two of them take the juvenile delinquency of the 1950s to the next level, and then some. But while earlier outlaws Bonnie and Clyde were high-minded enough to want to derail authority on behalf of working-class people, Kit and Holly have no such great aspirations. In fact, they seem to have few aspirations at all, as they sleepwalk through their lives. In their world, committing murder is almost as banal as twirling a baton, the very childlike activity Holly's practicing when Kit first spots her in her front yard. Days of Heaven, on the other hand, is less horrifying on the surface, concerning itself with an ill-fated love triangle on the prairie. However, it soon proves to be just as tragic and remote as its counterpart, Badlands. Set primarily in the Texas Panhandle in the 1910s, Abby and Bill, Brooke Adams and Richard Gere, are two lovers on the run, the same as Kit and Holly. Only instead of a murder spree, they end up on a vast wheat farm where they pose as brother and sister and ultimately devise a scheme to marry off Abby to the wealthy yet lonely farmer who runs the property, Sam Shepard. Observing it all is Bill's actual sister, Linda, played by a brilliant teenage Linda Manns, who's relegated to the sidelines of the story yet serves as its emotional epicenter nonetheless. Despite the bleakness of the character's circumstances, Malick's films are nothing if not stunning. The influence of American art permeates Days of Heaven, in particular the work of Andrew Wyeth and Edward Hopper. When Abby first meets the farmer, she emerges from the pastoral scene like the figure in Wyeth's Christina's World. The farmer's house, referred to as the Belvedere, is a work of art unto itself. It lingers like a specter over the wheat fields and is instantly reminiscent of Edward Hopper's famed painting House by the Railroad. With nothing around it but open fields and open skies, it seems as if the house is doomed to be haunted, if not by a literal ghost, then by the land itself. It's worth noting that Hopper's House by the Railroad inspired not only the farmer's home in Days of Heaven, but also a far more famous cinematic abode, Norman Bates' Gothic hilltop mansion in Psycho. This serves as yet another horror connection in Malick's world, one that was probably not lost on the director. But the horror connections don't end there. There's something particularly strange and even spooky in the farmer's countenance. Not only does his property serve as a nexus for the film, a rural haunted house that seems more like a wax museum than a cozy home, but the farmer rarely speaks, and he's never even given a name. Instead, he looms over the film like something ethereal, a figure both there and not there. Early on, the audience, along with Bill, learns that the farmer is terminally ill with an unspecified malady, thereby imbuing his entire screen presence with an elegiac quality. Actor Sam Shepard even went so far as to describe his character as a ghost, a description that only enhances the already haunting qualities of the performance. In his character, death has come to the prairie, and by the end, no one will be spared from its whirlwind. In an initial version of the script, Shepard's character was more fleshed out, boasting a fully realized backstory and even given a proper name, Chuck. Indeed, all the characters were given richer and more complex backgrounds in the first draft of the film. Nevertheless, in this original and far more loquacious version of Days of Heaven, the film loses much of its mystery and its weird, horrific elements along with it. All work and no play. In their brutal yet beautiful landscapes, both Badlands and Days of Heaven offer a strange window into the soul of the country, the old, weird America, as it were. Whether we're following Kit and Holly as they walk down a small-town street or cruise across the plains in their Mercury coupe, or observe Abby and Bill toiling away in the wheat fields, these are familiar places. In fact, this is the quintessential American West. The purview of John Wayne, a frontiersman of the rugged individualism that allegedly defines the country. Yet through Malik's keen perspective, there's no sentimentality, no eager nostalgia. Instead, this is an unvarnished United States, one that's rotting away from the inside out. There's a dreamlike quality to the settings, to be sure, but the gorgeous landscapes are forever threatening to devolve at any moment into the nightmarish. More than that, the nightmare that's ready to erupt is hardly anything surreal in the vein of David Lynch, though we just said that there is some similarities. Malik's horrors are far more mundane than that. They're filled with everyday terrors, even pedestrian ones. In Days of Heaven, there are long, uninterrupted shots of workers in filthy mills and in filthy fields, of flames burning bright as hellfire in blast furnaces in Chicago, and of threshers slicing and dicing wheat and whatever small animals get in the way in Texas. In Badlands, we see garbage men thanklessly collecting the detritus of a small town, and cowboys capturing the livestock and brutally force-feeding them pills. At one point during a grueling afternoon on a farm, Kit stands on the carcass of a cow, its jaw slung open, its black eyes wide, the reasons for its death unknown. It's rare in the world of cinema to find films so razor-focused on hard labor and all the everyday misery that goes with it. It's a subtle but unmistakable subversion of the so-called American dream. As a culture, we venerate hard work in the abstract, blithely forgetting how grueling and backbreaking traditional blue-collar labor truly is. Malik's films, especially Badlands and Days of Heaven, never shy away from the realities of perilous employment, how soul-crushing it can be to simply make an honest day's wage. And the truth is, there are few things brimming with more existential horror than being indebted to an overlord who disregards your basic existence. For all his frailty and innocence, the farmer is still the proverbial man, forcing the exhausted workers to spend their nights in the fields and small shacks while he lives in relative luxury in a mansion of his own only yards away. Days of Heaven notably opens in the grimy steel mills of Chicago, where in a fit of impulsive rage, Bill inadvertently kills his foreman, setting into motion his flight from Illinois to Texas with Abby and Linda in tow. In Malik's films, death and work are inextricably linked, one ultimately leading to the other, like a doomed snake devouring its own tail. Furthermore, the so-called Days of Heaven from the title arguably refer to the short-lived weeks in which Bill, Abby, and Linda coexist with the farmer in relative ease after his wedding to Abby, the four of them swimming together in the lake, playing baseball in the fields, and dining in a pristine white gazebo overlooking the land. There's no wheat to tend, no obligations to meet. In Malik's version, the closest you can get to bliss is a life that's far from the heavy toils of labor. Everything else is merely a routine horror in the making. In the embrace of the cold, unfeeling universe. There's a deep level of emotional detachment in Badlands and Days of Heaven, something that's come to define the legacies of both films. Sissy Spacek's almost somnambulent voiceover as Holly gives the impression she's merely relaying the weather or some other prosaic news rather than recounting a crime spree that remains notorious to this day. In this detachment, there's a vein of cosmic horror, albeit one without a trace of elder gods. Instead, the unspeakable horror exists in the emotionless faces of Kit and Holly, two so-called lovers who are utterly lacking anything resembling love. Together, they're responsible for a brutal string of murders, but never for a moment do either of them seem to derive a bit of joy or exhilaration from it. Even sex holds no pleasure for the two of them. Is that all there is to it? Holly asks after she and Kit consummate their relationship. Gosh, what was everybody talking about? Malik's is a universe imbued with unspeakable beauty, but is wholly unfeeling. There's a pointlessness to it all. While other killers on the run films like Natural Born Killers have been accused of inspiring real-life crime sprees, it would be hard to imagine anyone watching Badlands and wanting to emulate its passive nihilism. There are no heroes here, no anti-heroes either. It's a wasteland devoid of feeling and perhaps just as importantly, devoid of encouragement. If anything, it might be one of the most anti-crime films ever made, simply for how incredibly trite it makes murder look. In its casual detachment, Badlands seems to suggest that you can commit the ultimate sin, but you'll get nothing out of it. Homicide is merely more of the same. There's also a sense of cosmic dread in the climax of Days of Heaven as a literal plague of locusts descends on the property at precisely the same time the farmer realizes he's been betrayed. It's as if Abby and Bill's cruel ruse has upset the balance of nature itself, sending all their lives spiraling into irrevocable heartbreak and chaos. But even still, there's an indifference to it. The locusts arrive, but they don't concern themselves with the people there, the lives and the land they're ruining. Their nature is to devour everything in their path, and that's precisely what they do, leaving no farm and no hope in their wake. Exploring the unlikely Gothic. The Gothic is alive and well in Malik's first two films, and that's particularly true of their use of young female narrators. In Days of Heaven, Linda provides a shrewd voiceover that turns tragic, terrifying, and even hilariously macabre. Throughout it all, death is second nature to her, something omnipresent and inescapable. She speaks of the devil as though she knows him personally, like he's just another hitcher on the railroad or a worker beside her in the field. I think the devil was on the farm, she says, as we move ever closer to the inevitable blowout between the farmer and Bill. Linda's narration shares a certain precocious quality with that of Mary Cat Blackwood and Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, at once wise beyond her years and impossibly young. Mary Cat and Linda each see the world in terms of its inherent dangers. Both girls also reside on ancestral properties that will ultimately endure a reckoning of fire. Similarly, Holly's narration in Badlands also has a decidedly Shirley Jackson quality to it, one of casual mistrust in others and the world at large. Like Mary Cat, Holly takes part in murder, if only as a bystander, and also like Mary Cat, she seems curiously unaffected by its consequences. Life and death don't seem to hold the same weight for them. In keeping with the Gothic tradition, Badlands and Days of Heaven both feature life-altering fires on which the plots ultimately hinge. After Kit murders Holly's father, the first of many homicides in the film, he returns at night, douses the place in gasoline, and sets it alight. As the bright butter yellow home, which already resembles a dollhouse, burns to the ground, the audience sees a literal dollhouse in Holly's bedroom as it turns to cinders as well. It's virtually undeniable. This moment marks the irrevocable end of Holly's innocence, a sort of threshold crossing from which there will be no return. In Days of Heaven, fire marks the end of the farmer's innocence as well. After weeks of speculation, he's at last seen Abby, the woman he refers to as an angel earlier in the film, for who she really is. A con artist, as his foreman and old friend calls her. As the plague of locusts sweeps over the farm, he hopes that burning them out will save the wheat, all to no avail. Now, with his one chance to find love gone forever and his farm likely lost as well, the farmer tracks down Bill, intent on murdering him for his betrayal. But unlike Bill and Kit, he can't quite bring himself to commit such a vicious act. It's in the farmer's single moment of hesitation that Bill gains the upper hand and fatally stabs him. After all, murder is not new territory for Bill, and old instincts die hard. Once again, Bill must go on the run with Abby and Linda, this time taking an impromptu boat ride down the river that echoes Charles Laughton's seminal The Night of the Hunter. But even as they manage to navigate past many unfriendly faces on the shore, people that Linda speculates are calling for help or something, or they were trying to bury somebody. The trio don't make it far before the authorities catch up with them, gunning Bill down in the water. Likewise, Kit and Holly's journey does not end well for them. After a grim chase, they're both arrested, and Kit is taken away, presumably to face execution. While Malik's films frequently veer toward the unfeeling, they're also somewhere that killers don't ultimately go free. A small semblance of justice in a world that hardly seems to acknowledge such a thing exists. Into an uncertain future. After the mixed reception of Days of Heaven, it would be 20 years before Malik made another film. His disappearance became one of the more legendary exits from cinema, a director leaving the industry at what should have been the top of his game. Malik has, of course, resurfaced over the past quarter century, creating some of his most lauded works in the process, including The Thin Red Line, The New World, and Tree of Life. However, none of these films quite capture the same strange and indescribable energy of his first two cinematic outings. With Badlands and Days of Heaven, he effortlessly tapped into a vein of the gothic, of the uncanny and the haunting, of the horrors shared every day by everyday people. These films are both breathtaking achievements, dripping with existential despair and exquisite beauty. But for all their vast and wondrous landscapes, it's in the small moments of Malik's work where he shows just how awe-inspiring the world can be while also so casually cruel and dangerous. Some sights that I saw was really spooky, Linda says in Days of Heaven as she, Abby, and Bill are headed down the river together at night fleeing her brother's latest murder. It could be the dead coming for me. Yet with menace and decay always looming in Malik's field, the dead aren't coming for us. They're already here. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Very awesome. I just want to make sure that I put you back instead of accidentally kicking you out.
I'll come back. You can't get rid of me that
There we
easy.
go. All right. Well, all right. Thank you very much for that. My good friend Michael here says, gorgeous essay. I'll need to rewatch these. All right. So thank you very much for reading that. I absolutely loved reading it. I was like drawn in immediately from like the first paragraph. And before we move on to Daniel, I wanted to ask, but I never got to it. What made you want to write about Malik?
I hadn't seen very much. Like, I always love when I'm finding films and I'm really connecting with them. I always love reading film criticism. I'm such a big fan of reading film criticism. And when I was looking up Days of Heaven and Badlands, I found nothing that talked about how they felt very gothic or that there was these horror elements. And I'm like, oh, this is so sad. And then I'm like, oh, well, I write nonfiction. Why don't I go write this article that I want to read? And so that was really just, so if somebody else had already written something like this, I might not have. I might have just been like, okay, it's cool. But like, I was really kind of like craving having some of that kind of film criticism. Like, they always say, write write the stuff you want to read. So I'm like, okay, I'll go write this essay. see if John wants to publish it. I was worried it was going to be too niche or something when I sent it in to you. I'm like, I don't know, this might be weird. I even said that to my husband, but I'm like, I don't know, it feels like the spirit of Vastarian, so I'll at least give it a try.
It was perfect.
When I first read the title, I was like, Malik? That's interesting. But it turned into something absolutely like relevant and quite awesome, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you wrote it. It so helped me with my appreciation of Malik, who I already appreciated. But
all right, so we're going to move on to the last segment of tonight's show. Daniel Braum, how you doing?
Doing well. So happy to be here with you all.
So your story is a piece of fiction that's in this most recent issue of Vastarian is 29 Palms in Reverse. I would like to know, as I always want to know where I always ask the writers I talk to this question, but I really want to know yours because this story is so subtle. It could be a Malik film.
Well, that's thank you so much.
But I want to know, what was the genesis behind the story?
I wonder, and I was thinking about it in anticipation that you might ask that, and I think it was pretty much the image. There's an image which is a little bit different than the way I write. I tend to write, my inspirations come from settings. I'm often, or most of the time, inspired from a setting, and that is the sort of the magic of it, the intangible part that you can't control. And once I've determined that I want to write about a setting, is when the craft comes in, and I work it, and I try to come up with characters and conflicts that can only be expressed through these settings. And just in thinking about our discussion of Malik, I'm realizing just how influenced I must have been from a thin red line. That was a film that I watched right as I was starting to write, because I think all three of these films, but at the time I started writing, I hadn't seen Badlands or Days of Heaven. All three of those films are very setting heavy, very setting important films.
Michael Michael Schutz says, "Shout out to How to Stay Afloat While Drowning."
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, another setting, heavy thing. So this story, 29 Palms in Reverse. It's set in Joshua Tree National Park, and one of the things that inspires me about that area, that inspires me about that part of Southern California and about the desert, is something that does intersect with both the Malik and intersect with the Ligotti, even though at the time that I was being inspired by it, I didn't have a framework for it, or I didn't have words for it, at least in this artistic sense. But it is a place that is both sublimely beautiful and awe-inspiring, yet at the same time, every step is full of danger and horror, and not malice. Like the desert will kill you without even contemplating you, just as you are admiring its beauty. And that's something that I've since learned, is something in a lot of weird fiction. It is something that is in cosmic horror, and we see that in the Malik films. And that's something, without even knowing about it, that was something I wanted to capture, that aspect in a story, or at least in a desert story. And I just, you asked like where did the genesis come from? I mean, I just love writing about and portraying the desert.
I also really like some of the symbolism that comes in, like the mysterious, the visions of the woman. Is this something that comes to you right away with the setting, or is it something you work on as you go through drafts?
Like that's one of the things where I want to take credit for it and say, of course, I'm so glad you saw that. And I worked so hard on putting it in there. But I think when you have symbolism or theme or things that come up there, a lot of it with me, it happens at some point, and when I look back and I haven't edited it away, and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess it's there, and I know it's done. So I think a lot of that is not happening for me on a conscious level. This story was a little bit different because the setting is a real setting. There is a place in the Joshua Tree National Park that is the most remote. It is unmapped. It is hard to find, and the Joshua trees are the oldest of these very, very old creatures, and there is something awe-inspiring about nature, or even places like that. And the time when I had visited there, and I used to live in California, and I used to get a chance to visit it a lot. But at one particular time, I just had this this notion of just as we're converging on a place, something is converging on us, and it just came. It wasn't quite a dream; it was a waking dream, and it was just one of those. It was just one of those things that you imagine, and you're like, oh, someday I will write about it. And I held it for a while, then eventually thought of a way of how to embody it in dramatic structure. So it was nothing more than saying like, oh, that's something cool. I wonder how I could put that in a story and have it, and still have it be coherent, and be a coherent story. And hopefully I achieved that in the story.
Well, I think you did. All right, so Daniel here is going to read a piece from his story, 29 Palms in Reverse. And I'm going to put you on full screen and mute the rest of us, and you can just go right ahead. Okay, Dan?
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, solo layout.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to read a few minutes from 29 Palms in Reverse, from the most recent issue of Vastarian Literary Journal. 29 Palms, California. Yuli isn't here for the reason Noam thinks. He pulls the key from the ignition and exhales, his other hand still gripping the wheel. The line of sandy brown earth and gray exposed rocks snaking its way through the Joshua trees and cactus and brush all the way to the mountain ridge in the distance barely qualifies as a dirt road. Yuli opens the rental jeep's door and dry desert heat hits, the hot, fragrant air overcoming artificially cool and sterile. She secures her camera strap around her neck. The jeep's engine is still rumbling, unhappy about the steep, jagged incline Noam has just gunned his way up. She didn't think he had it in him. He spotted something. Don't tell me, Yuli says. I want to try. Why bring your personal spotter then? She shushes him by blowing him a kiss the way she always does, then flips her hair and searches the ridge for bighorn sheep through her long lens. There are none. Movement in the corner of her vision catches her attention. Too tall for a bighorn. A person? Someone walking? She can't zero in. She searches the stillness between the jeep and the ridge. It's a prehistoric landscape of surreal rock formation and ancient 20 to 30 foot Joshua trees, their crooked limbs towering over patches of barrel cacti and silvery, bush-like cholla, undisturbed by tourists and climbers from LA. There are no other vehicles. We're probably outside the park, she thinks. She lowers the camera. Canine prints and tracks of a bird, probably a roadrunner or quail, are in the earth before her, a story of passage in the dried-up evidence of a flash flood. Then she sees what Noam stopped for, a tortoise crossing the road only a few yards away, its dome shell scarred with healed-over cracks. From its size, she guesses it might even be older than the Joshua trees. She picks it up, turns it around, and places it in the safety of the rock formation from where it began its crossing. She glances at Noam, leaning on the jeep in his jeans and white tee, as he's scanning the ridge in the distance, looking cool as a cucumber with his week-old scruff and mop of unruly brown hair, and his expression unaware of her and focused on the landscape before them. She finds him and the whole moment beautiful, a frame of a 1950s movie come to life. The first time I came out here, I was still in school, Yuli says. We were all such dopes. I don't remember having any water and was probably wearing sneakers. This guy who was with us, he wasn't bright at all. We all thought he was stripping to pay his way through school. He yells from up ahead, "Hey, look, there's a big boa sleeping up here. I found a boa." I knew enough about snakes to know there are no boas out here, but the first thing my mind thinks is, wow, he's found a boa, and it's probably someone's lost pet, and we have to save it. So we catch up with him, and I stick my face in the rocks where he's pointing, and yeah, there's a big-ass snake coiled up sleeping in there, only it's not a boa. It's a 6-foot plus thick diamondback rattlesnake. Juliana, you're doing it again, Noam says. Am I? Noam nods. I am. Sorry. It's just California is where I started. It's where I started being me. I want to show you everything. I want you to know all of it, too. I wish we could be somewhere that's new ground for both of us, Noam says. That's what couples do. I'm taking California back from my past, so it's ours now, too. That's also something couples do. She notices movement again. She was right. Someone is way out there at the foot of the ridge. A woman, dwarfed by the Joshua trees, slowly walking towards them. Yuli brings her camera to her eye, pushes the lens to the max, trying to zero in, unable to keep the woman in the frame. She zooms out, spotting her briefly, before losing her among the ancient trunks. And there you go, Gnome says. He's holding the tortoise, its legs moving in the air. He places it on the other side of the dirt path. You're not supposed to put them back, he says. You're supposed to help them cross. Cross? This isn't even a road. This isn't even anywhere, Yuli says. She walks to him and kisses his cheek. Is my spotter getting grumpy? Need some water and AC? No, I'm not sure we're even in the right place. I don't think this is the right ridge. There's supposed to be a pool of runoff, a watering hole. Maybe we shouldn't have gone up that incline. Gnome scans the plain with his binoculars. See anything? Yuli asks. She's hoping he finds a mountain lion. Steve from the guest house said they're out here, but nearly impossible to spot during the day unless moving. And they won't be moving unless going for water or prey. Nothing, Gnome says after a pause that feels too long. Before she can ask him what's wrong or tell him to get over himself, she's not sure which, he lowers the binoculars and points. Kestrel, 50 feet ahead, he says. See that Joshua tree? The one that looks sort of like a windmill? Check. See it. Third branch up, halfway to the spiky leaf tufts at the end, there's a kestrel trying to stuff a dead baby snake in its hollow. Ooh, I see it. The tiny snake, not dead after all, doubles back on itself, lunging with fangs bared. Ooh, look at that. You're so good to me. Now that's what I like to hear. Don't ever say I don't do anything for you. Yuli photographs the snake as it frees itself and falls. She wonders about the pause in Gnome's reply. Did he see the woman out there too? The sun is ready to go down. The big blue open desert sky behind the ridge will soon be filled with color. The kestrel takes flight, its gliding arc the only motion in the windless natural garden. There is something kinetic in the stillness. It dawns on her it's been too long since she's felt this connected and alive. Steve and his husband of the same name designed the guest house themselves and had it constructed entirely from materials found on their sprawling acreage just inside the border of the national park. The low building stone and timber contour is made to resemble the ridge on the horizon behind it and fit in with the natural landscape. Yuli chose it because she hoped Gnome would love it. The four of them finish dinner and sit at the long reclaimed wood table by the big window, granting a perfect view of outside. The Joshua trees are not nearly as tall as the ones from this afternoon. Steve's grandfather bought the land decades ago, before the park was a park, the Steve, who is a former chef, says. So we're literally grandfathered in around the no building and living inside the park rules, as Steve likes to say. Well, the hippies and climbers always knew 29 Palms was the place to be, the other Steve says. He's the one Yuli spoke to when booking and is also a guide. They knew the LA people and hipsters would one day creep in. Which one was your grandfather? Steve asks as he gathers the plates. Yuli goes outside. Dusk is bathing the rock and cactus and ocotillo and all the desert things in shadow. She catches Gnome staring too. Good question, Steve answers. Give it 10 years. No one's going to recognize this place. Change is the only constant, my dear. Is it? Our guests don't want to hear us debate and philosophize. Quite the contrary, Gnome says. So did you find the watering hole in the bighorns? Steve asks. Didn't find the water, Gnome says. We were up that steep part to where the big Joshua trees are. Oh, you were right there. That's the oldest part of the forest. You're lucky you didn't break an axle. Yeah, no signal, you'd be fucked, Steve says, carrying the plates into the kitchen. Pardon my husband's French. It's almost dark. Say, Give it an hour, then we meet back here for that night walk. Night walk? Deadly scorpions, Steve calls from the kitchen. I pass. Yuli finds herself jealous of the giddy, affectionate expression that comes over Steve's face in response to his husband's foolery. She and Gnome bring their gear from the Jeep into their room. The entrance into their small cave-like space is a glass door providing an unobstructed view of the property and the desert beyond. We going to unpack, or Yuli playfully pushes Gnome onto the bed and jumps on him, pulling at their clothes, hoping her frenzied kisses will come across as passionate. The connection she felt outside translates to the moment. This is something better than at home. Almost good again, she thinks. She closes her eyes in surrender. An image of the woman walking through the trees is there waiting. After, lying there naked, catching her breath with him, she can't point to why she feels dissatisfied. What? Gnome says. You weren't into it, were you? I felt you weren't. What? I totally was. What were you thinking? Yuli asked. Come on, where were you? Here. I mean, at one point I felt you weren't really here. Then I got lost in it all. Lost in it, huh? I'll show you how into I am, Gnome says, but we're going to miss the hike. As they're squirming into their clothes, Yuli is startled by a woman walking towards her, but it is only the reflection from the bedside lamp glare on the glass. Steve, the guide, knows every inch of the property. Under the stars and moon, the desert is a different kind of gorgeous. Silver leaves, spindly cactus arms, and all the rocks and textures take on new color and shape in the light of night and its shadows. Steve does not deliver on his promise of a scorpion for her to shoot, but there are plenty of active long-tailed kangaroo rats scavenging, and one rattler that escapes into a burrow after pleasing them with its namesake warning. Her prize is the tarantula Gnome spots on a cactus at the end of the walk near the house. In the middle of the night, while Gnome is sleeping, she returns outside to search for the spider again. The sound of coyotes yipping and barking fills the silence. She is unsure if the pack is coming or going. Gnome was right. It was her who wasn't present while they were fucking. She was wondering about the woman out there and envisioning the giant trees lit by stars and all the shades of brown at night in a negative image of the day. And it is not that she doesn't want him. Mostly she does, and she thinks she loves him, at least more than she's loved anyone before. The burden is that this isn't what she thought being 35 would be. She doesn't know what it should be, and would say fuck off to anyone who tried to tell her. Though there is nothing wrong, she knows her life is not supposed to be the one she is living. She knows this awareness is a dangerous cage to be in, and one even more dangerous to wake up in with regret years later. She was not lying. The twin thought of the truth she told Gnome is that she is also here to decide if she is going to leave him. A water droplet lands on her, then another. The cloudless sky empties of rain. She wasn't sure if it ever rained in the desert. She knew it must. Now she knows the truth firsthand. The downpour stops a minute later. She spots the spider on the cactus, touching a droplet beaded on the tip of a thorn with its front legs. She listens for the sound of a flash flood in the canyon she knows must be on the other side of the ridge in the distance. I think that's a good place to stop, so I will just stop it right there. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Dan. Just let me pull you back up here. I just want to make sure I don't kick you out. Because they put the button right beside each other, remove from stream.
Oh, I've done it. I've done it more than once to a guest.
There we go. All right. So, thank you very much. That was awesome.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading that, and it's been a couple years. I was wondering if you have any new collections planned to come out anytime soon.
I do. I do have a new collection. I'm not able to announce that one just yet, but I do have a bunch of work. Do have a lot of work that's going to be coming out in 2023. Not all of it has been announced, but Cemetery Dance trade paperbacks is going to be printing a trade paperback edition of my novella, The Serpent's Shadow, which is right now, it's only out as an ebook, but in the spring, that's going to be a trade paperback. And in the fall, they're going to be reissuing The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales, which is my first collection. And
Awesome.
thank you. Yeah, and Les Press is going to be, I think in 2023, publishing my first novel. It'll either be in 2023 or 2024. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share some more work with you all. Thank you.
All right, so I am going to wrap things up. I want to thank everyone for coming out and commenting throughout this whole thing. This is, I think, one of my more successful live streams. So thanks everyone, and I want to thank you, Daniel Braum, for coming up with the idea for this and then pretty much organizing it. And I want to thank Jon. Thank you so much for coming. I've always wanted to talk to you ever since reading this Secrets of Ventriloquism, because I listened
Such
to
a tremendous collection.
I listened to the audiobook of that, and I was telling Jon before we went live, I was listening to that while traveling to work. It's like a good 30-minute drive to and from work, and I was listening to it in the winter. I work 12-hour shifts, so it's like 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or vice versa. And so I'm always in the dark when it's in the winter, and it was very snowy and very isolated, traveling through farm fields, or not through farm fields, but down the road where there's all farm fields, and it's very isolating driving. And listening to Jon read those stories in my car was absolutely unsettling, and I loved it. And Gwendolyn, I talked to you, me and Michael Schutz talked to you on the Darkness Dwells podcast a few years ago, and that was an absolute honor. It was an absolute honor having you on my YouTube channel. And I hope that I can all talk to you guys again sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was great. It was great spending time with all of you. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to end the broadcast now. Thanks again, everyone.